I would now like to introduce someone who does a great deal to promote strategic cooperation between the United States and Africa. Ambassador Vicki Huddleston, our keynote speaker this morning, is Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Africa. She is Secretary of Defense Gates's senior advisor on Africa, and she is the voice of the Department of Defense in many of the policy discussions within the U.S. government regarding Africa. As a former career diplomat, Ambassador Huddleston has significant experience in Africa. Among her diplomatic assignments, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, as U.S. Ambassador to Madagascar, as U.S. Ambassador to Mali, and as Chief of Mission and Acting Ambassador in Ethiopia during a turbulent time there in the past decade. She was also lucky enough to serve as Chief of Mission and Acting Ambassador in Havana, Cuba, for several years. After leaving the Foreign Service, she was affiliated with a leading Washington think tank before being recalled to service shortly after the election of President Barack Obama. So it is an honor to welcome today Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Ambassador Vicki Huddleston.
Mark, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I appreciate it. And I first of all wanted to begin by acknowledging Ambassador Tom Krzyzewski, who's our Vice President. I think that's the right title of the National Defense University. And also there's another DASTI, as we call ourselves, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense here in the audience today, and that's Teresa Whalen, who is DASTI for Homeland Security. So I know that you all will enjoy meeting and talking to them. I also want to acknowledge that we have a summer intern from my office here with us today, and that's Nathaniel Anderson. And interestingly enough, he probably won't like it that I'm admitting this, but his mother is also a DASTI, and she's responsible for Russia and in that large area of Eastern Europe. So it's a pleasure to see all of you here today. But most of all, it's a great pleasure to have the honor to speak to senior military and civilian leaders from around Africa. And indeed, I wouldn't have had this honor had General Han been able to be here. And I think that that is a great disappointment to all of us, but I'll try to compensate by talking a little bit about General Han, and I'm sure I will be saying things about General Han that he probably wouldn't be saying himself. But I wanted to use General Han as an example of a senior leader with courage, dedication, intelligence that can make the right decisions and do what his country calls upon him to do. And that, in the end, is exactly what every one of you here want to be able to do, to make the right decisions and to act with courage and dedication on behalf of your nation. General Han was only 2 weeks in his job as commander of the United States African Command when he was asked to carry out United Nations Resolution 1973 that calls for an embargo on Libya, to impose a no-fly zone, and to protect civilians with all possible measures. And this command, AFRICOM, that had never really thought that they would fight a war or a conflict or impose a no-fly zone in Africa, found itself called upon in a matter of days to form a coalition of the willing and to impose that no-fly zone, but also to protect civilians. And literally from the 17th of March, when that resolution passed at the United Nations, until the 19th of March, 2 days or 2.5 days, General Han had to bring about this coalition and to start the imposition of the no-fly zone. That's pretty impressive, especially for a general that had just taken command, and a command that in fact is our newest command and had never before been involved in a conflict. In fact, I hope that you have an opportunity after this discussion or this speech this morning to talk a little bit with Teresa Whalen, because I didn't mention that she was the first Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Africa, and therefore she was at the creation of the United States African Command. But what General Ham and this coalition did was to protect innocent civilians, civilians that Colonel Gaddafi had said that he would hunt down door to door and show no mercy to. That is the kind of courage, that is the kind of dedication that we hope you will gain, not just from this seminar, but also from your comrades and your friends and the people that you will meet as you attend this seminar. It is important that you do so because Africa, as Ambassador Bellamy just pointed out, faces many challenges. Africa obviously faces many opportunities. You have great human resources, and I see those here in this conference room today. You have enormous natural resources. You have great leaders and a great history. But I am here to talk a little bit about those challenges because that is where the United States African Command is working with you. You have transnational threats from extremism, from trafficking in every sort of way that we can think of, from people to arms to drugs that threaten your nations. You have threats and significant threats from Mother Nature herself, drought, floods, hurricanes, and volcanic eruptions. You have many things that must be faced that are not, in fact, of Africa's making, but are transnational in origin. And then you have homegrown threats. You have religious and ethnic divisions. You have extreme poverty in many areas despite this unprecedented economic growth that Ambassador Bellamy has spoken of. And it is AFRICOM that wants to work with you to build your capacity on the military side in particular so that you can deal, so that your armed forces can deal with these threats. Because if your countries are not stable, if your countries cannot protect their borders, if your countries cannot prevent internal conflict, then there cannot be the kind of development that every African wants to enjoy. There cannot be the kind of democracy and good governance and civilian leadership that those of you from the civilian side of the house who are in this audience today want to see take place in Africa. So let me just point out a couple of areas where AFRICOM is focusing with you to help you build that capacity. First of all, let me talk about extremism, because for the United States government, that is a major priority, if not the major priority for us, because that is protection of the homeland. Just as each one of you has militaries that must protect the homeland, so too do we. And the two areas where we focus on are first, Somalia. And in Somalia, what we have done is pair our AFRICOM trainers with the trainers from the Department of State who work in ACOTA. And I know many of you are well aware of ACOTA because it works in many of your countries, because in the audience I know there are many militaries that participate in peacekeeping across Africa and even beyond. Therefore, these trainers who are from AFRICOM who are pairing with the AFOTA training have provided some really special training, counterinsurgency training, so that the Burundians and the Ugandans are better prepared for the kind of fight that they have been willing to go into on the behalf of the African Union and the United Nations. And I believe that there are both Burundians and Ugandans in the audience today, and I would like just to say that your courage, your dedication to another country to help make that country stable and give the people of that country an opportunity to have a stable and democratic government is much appreciated by my nation, but I'm sure by nations throughout the world and of course on the continent. But that is one of the areas, the principal area of extremism, where we are trying to help you have the capacity, African forces have the capacity to face the threat. Another area is Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb that operates across Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Algeria, and North Africa. We recognize that we are not the leader here. We recognize that we are not the leader in Somalia. We recognize that the individual countries are the leaders here. But what we are doing, once again, building capacity with the Malian armed forces, building capacity with the Mauritanian and the Chadian armed forces, and we will once again begin to work with the Nigerian armed forces. But one of the things we always insist upon in AFRICOM is that the military is under civilian leadership. And so we were not working with Niger during the time of first the coup by the constitutional coup by President Tangi, and then when there was a military coup. So we look forward again to working with them. But it is not true, as perhaps sometimes you have heard, that AFRICOM or the United States is just concerned about extremism. We are equally concerned about those other challenges that you face in Africa. Challenges such as Sudan, Congo, Liberia. In each one of these countries, AFRICOM has contributed to helping not only the country across the board, but the military as well. In Liberia, we are training 2,000 troops to be the new armed forces of Liberia, training them in human rights, training them in good governance, training them in international military law, so that we are providing a professional military to the new government of Liberia. In Congo, we have trained a battalion, and the 391st Battalion is now up in Dungo, and we hope to see that battalion better able to protect the people of the Congo from the horrors of the Lord's Resistance Army. And I think our training in Southern Sudan actually is perhaps in some ways the most interesting and perhaps the most appropriate, because what we have done in Southern Sudan to help build that force and professionalize them is we have asked the Ethiopians and the Kenyans to work with the Southern Sudanese. So we have paid the bill, but we have asked other African forces to do that training. And that's the kind of thing we really like to see across Africa. We like to see you, the Africans, taking charge of your armed forces, of your institutions, and see ourselves as in a supporting role. Which of course then brings me back to AFRICOM is not as advertised. Yes, we thought AFRICOM was just going to do all those good things I talked about, build capacity for peacekeepers, build your internal capacity, and also to build your engineering capacity so that you can carry out civil military projects. One of my disappointments still in Africa is that I have not yet seen African militaries doing enough on the civilian military side. That is, repairing hospitals, sinking wells, building schools and roads. Those things that matter so much to your populations and to development. And as you know, AFRICOM itself is doing some of those civil military tasks with your civilian and military leaderships, both across the Sahel and in East Africa. But if AFRICOM is not as advertised, it is not surprising, because all armed forces must be prepared to use force. At the same time, they must be prepared to use force in a way that observes international law and under international regulations, just as AFRICOM and NATO are operating in Libya. But I am also well aware that all of you in this room are not in agreement about Libya. We know that the African Union itself has had hesitations about the coalition and now about NATO. And we understand those hesitations. After all, Africa has a long history of colonialism, and having intervention from the outside is not what any African, nor indeed any American or European, would want. It is preferable always that Africans take the lead in all these matters. It is hopefully only in matters, exceptional matters, when civilians are at risk, greatly at risk, because their own military has turned upon them. But let me say that I believe that with this kind of training, with the kind of capacity that I see in this room, Libya will probably never happen again. Because what happened in Egypt and Tunisia, the military made the right decision. There was no need for outside intervention. The people were respected. The Constitution was respected. The governing institutions were respected. So there was no need for a coalition led by the United States and then turned over to NATO. If militaries are well trained, and I would argue that Libya was not, but your militaries are, or you wouldn't be here, then Libya will not happen again in Africa. Or if it does, then it will be you, the Africans, with the capacity that you have developed, who will respond to these conflicts and crises. Let me just wind up this presentation by referring to a great president, a great wartime president, but a great president across the board of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And you know, I was just going to tell you this wonderful quote of Roosevelt, but I had just read this morning something else about Roosevelt, and it was just so telling. Apparently, Roosevelt only went to Africa once, was when he went to North Africa, obviously, during World War II. But he went to sub-Saharan Africa, Liberia. And he looked at Liberia and he said, how is this possible? You know, this is a country that the United States has a lot of responsibility for settling. And how is it possible that this kind of poverty exists? And then he went to British Gambia at the time. And he said, I'm going to tell Roosevelt, this is not, I'm going to tell Churchill, this is not acceptable. This man had so much foresight, not just as a great leader for the United States, particularly during the Great War, but really for Africa and the world as a whole. And one of the things that he said that I think must stay with us is that what we must try to do is preserve 4 essential freedoms in the world. Freedom of speech and assembly everywhere in the world. Freedom of religion everywhere in the world. Freedom from hunger everywhere in the world. And freedom from fear anywhere in the world. Thank you very much.